You've seen it before. A tank rolling across a battlefield. Then, suddenly, a flash. A violent impact. 30 tons of steel freeze in place as smoke pours from the hull. From far away, it almost looks clean. But what happens inside?
By 1916, the Western Front had become a massive system of trenches stretching across Europe. Barbed wire covered the open ground. Machine guns tore apart anyone who tried to advance. Artillery turned entire landscapes into craters. Thousands of soldiers could die for a few hundred meters of land. The battlefield had become a machine built to consume human lives. Military commanders desperately searched for something that could survive crossing no man's land. Something that could move through mud, crush barbed wire, and protect soldiers from machine gun fire. That was the moment the tank was born. At first, the British secretly called these machines land ships. But to hide the project from spies, they gave it a harmless code name: tank. As if it were nothing more than a water container. Nobody realized that this awkward metal box would become one of the most feared weapons in modern warfare. The early tanks were primitive and miserable to operate. They were painfully slow, mechanically unreliable, and unbearably hot inside. Engines sat directly beside the crew compartment. Toxic fumes filled the air. Temperatures inside could become almost unlivable during combat. Yet soldiers still climbed inside them willingly, because outside the tank was even worse. The armor itself was thin by modern standards. Some vehicles had steel plates barely thick enough to stop rifle rounds. And when armor-piercing bullets...
The first tank crews believed steel meant safety. Thick metal outside. Human beings inside. Simple. But war has a way of turning protection into a trap. During the First World War, soldiers discovered a terrifying phenomenon. Even when a bullet failed to penetrate a tank, the impact alone could still kill the crew inside. The shock wave from the hit traveled through the armor plate, and the inner surface of the steel began to crack apart. Tiny fragments of metal exploded inward at lethal speed, bouncing around the compartment like shrapnel inside a sealed box. This effect became known as spalling. Imagine sitting inside a steel room while the walls themselves suddenly turn into blades. That was the reality for early tank crews, and things got even worse because of how those tanks were built. Most early vehicles used riveted armor. Hundreds of metal rivets held the entire machine together. But under heavy impact, those rivets could snap loose and launch across the interior like bullets fired from inside the tank itself. Some crews survived the enemy shell, only to be killed by their own vehicle moments later. Then came another nightmare nobody expected. Molten lead. German. Soldiers began experimenting with improvised anti-tank ammunition. One strange method involved reversing rifle. Bullets backward inside the casing and packing extra powder behind them. Crude, dangerous, unstable. But against early armor, sometimes effective enough. When those rounds slammed into steel plates, friction generated enormous heat. In some cases, the lead core partially melted on impact. Tiny streams of molten metal sprayed through microscopic gaps in the armor. Through vision slits, seams, and weak points in the hull. The result was horrifying. Burning metal blasted directly into the faces and eyes of the crew inside. For many soldiers, the tank stopped feeling like protection. It started feeling like a furnace waiting to explode. The British tried solving the problem with protective gear for tank crews, heavy steel masks, reinforced goggles, even chainmail face protection, but none of it truly solved the real issue, because the battlefield was evolving faster than the machines built to survive it. German artillery. Crews quickly learned that a direct hit from field guns could obliterate early tanks completely. Soon, hidden anti-tank guns were positioned near the front lines specifically to ambush advancing armor. And suddenly, tanks were no longer unstoppable machines. They had become targets. That was the beginning of a pattern that would define the next century of warfare. Every time tanks improved, anti-tank weapons adapted. Every new layer of armor created a stronger shell. Every stronger shell forced engineers to redesign the armor again. Steel versus fire, protection versus penetration. Technological arms race with human lives trapped in the middle of it, and by the time the Second World War arrived, that race had escalated into something far deadlier than anyone in 1916 could have imagined. Because tanks were no longer experimental machines crossing muddy trenches, they had become the kings of the battlefield. When the Second World War began, tanks were no longer strange mechanical experiments. They had evolved into the center of modern warfare. Entire military doctrines now revolved around armored assaults. Fast-moving spearheads of steel smashed through enemy lines while infantry and aircraft followed behind. Countries weren't just building tanks anymore. We're building entire wars around them. And for a brief moment, it looked like armor had become unstoppable. Early anti-tank guns struggled badly against newer vehicles. Some heavily armored tanks became infamous for surviving absurd amounts of punishment. British crews even gave certain German anti-tank guns a humiliating nickname, door knockers, because hitting some tanks felt less like destroying them, and more like politely knocking on the armor and hoping something inside eventually broke. The French Char B-1 and British Matilda terrified German crews during the early years of the war. Some anti-tank guns had to fire again and again at close range just to disable them. And every time armor improved, anti-tank weapons had to grow larger to compensate. 30-7mm. Guns became 50, then 80-8, then monstrous. Anti-tank cannons over 100 millimeters wide appeared on battlefields across Europe. The escalation was happening at terrifying speed. By the later stages of the war, some anti-tank guns could destroy enemy armor from more than 2 kilometers away. Entire vehicles called tank destroyers were designed specifically for one purpose: hunting tanks. But while the weapons grew larger, what happened inside the target became even worse. Early armor-piercing rounds relied mostly on kinetic force. Punch through the armor, send fragments flying, and hope something critical gets hit. But engineers soon realized they could make anti-tank shells far more lethal, so they added explosives inside the round itself. The shell would penetrate the armor first, then milliseconds later, the explosive filler detonated inside the tank. That tiny delay changed everything. Now the penetration itself was only the beginning. The explosion scattered burning fragments through the crew compartment while igniting fuel, ammunition, hydraulic fluid, and anything else flammable inside. A tank could go from fully operational to an inferno almost instantly, and inside those vehicles, crews sat surrounded by everything needed to create a firestorm: fuel tanks, ammo racks, explosive shells, hot engines. The tank had become a pressure cooker filled with explosives. There are accounts from British tank crews in North Africa describing moments so horrifying they stayed burned into memory for decades. In one incident, a nearby tank was hit by an anti-tank gun while the radio operator inside was transmitting over comms. The rest of the formation heard everything: the impact, the fire, the screams, and then the horrifying realization that the crew inside was still alive while the tank burned around them. Some nearby crews reportedly opened fire on the disabled vehicle themselves, trying to end the suffering before the flames did. That is the reality most war movies never fully capture. A tank crew wasn't simply fighting the enemy outside. They were constantly one penetration away from being trapped inside a burning steel box with nowhere to escape, and escaping didn't guarantee survival either, because enemy infantry often fired directly at crews climbing out of destroyed tanks. Machine guns swept hatch openings. Burning vehicles became bait for follow-up attacks. War had stripped away every illusion of mercy. But even as anti-tank guns became deadlier, militaries discovered a major problem. The weapons were becoming too large, too heavy, too slow to reposition. Modern warfare was becoming faster and more mobile. And commanders realized they needed something smaller, something portable. A weapon ordinary infantry could carry themselves. That realization would change armored Warfare forever, because the next anti-tank weapon wouldn't rely on massive cannons. It would fit on a soldier's shoulder. For decades, tanks dominated battlefields because destroying them required massive weapons, heavy artillery, large anti-tank guns, entire crews operating oversized cannons. But during the Second World War, that suddenly changed. For the first time in history, a single infantry soldier could destroy a tank alone. And the technology that made it possible was terrifyingly clever. It was called the shaped charge. Unlike traditional armor-piercing shells, shaped charges didn't rely on raw speed or brute force to penetrate steel. Instead, they used physics in a way that almost felt unnatural. Inside the warhead was a con-shaped metal liner, usually made from copper, surrounded by explosives. When detonated, the explosion collapsed, the metal inward at extreme speed, creating a narrow jet of superheated particles, moving faster than most rifle bullets could ever dream of traveling. Not hundreds of meters per second, several kilometers per second. The result was horrifyingly efficient. Instead of smashing armor apart with impact, the shaped charge focused all its energy into a tiny point, burning through steel like a blowtorch cutting through paper. And once that jet entered the tank, the inside became hell. Molten metal, armor fragments, fire or freed, shrapnel bouncing through the crew compartment at impossible speed. The hole itself was often surprisingly small, sometimes barely wider than a finger. But what happened after penetration was what killed crews. The Americans were the first to deploy this concept, effectively with the bazooka. Compared to giant anti-tank guns, the weapon looked almost laughably simple. A tube on a soldier's shoulder firing a rocket-powered warhead, but suddenly, tanks had a new fear. Infantry hiding nearby. The psychological impact was enormous. Before shaped charges, tank crews mostly worried about artillery or large anti-tank guns visible from long distances. Now, any building, trench, or patch of forest could hide someone capable of killing them instantly. For the first time, armor no longer guaranteed dominance. The Germans quickly copied the idea after capturing American bazookas. Their own versions became larger, stronger, and eventually evolved into weapons like the Panzerschreck and Panzerfaust. And the Panzerfaust changed warfare completely. Cheap, disposable, easy to mass produce. By the later years of the war, Germany was losing its industrial advantage and could no longer compete tank for tank against the overwhelming numbers of Allied armor. So instead, it gave ordinary infantrymen weapons capable of destroying even heavily armored vehicles. The strategy was brutally simple. If you cannot outproduce enemy tanks, make tanks too dangerous to approach. Some later shaped charge weapons could penetrate around 200 millimeters of armor. No tank of that era was truly safe anymore, but there was a catch. Early launchers were horribly inaccurate to reliably hit a target. Soldiers often needed to get dangerously close, sometimes within 20 or 30 meters, close enough to hear the engine roar, close enough to see the crew through vision slits, and tanks rarely operated alone. Infantry escorts protected them specifically to stop anti-tank ambushes before they could happen. So using these weapons required nerve bordering on insanity. One mistake meant instant death. But even with all those limitations, shaped charges permanently changed armored warfare, because now the battlefield had entered a terrifying new phase, the age where inexpensive weapons could destroy machines worth fortunes. Pattern that still defines modern warfare today, and tank crews immediately began searching for ways to survive this new threat. That's when improvisation started, appearing everywhere. Sandbags tied to armor, spare tracks welded onto holes, logs strapped to the sides of vehicles. Anything that might create extra space between the shaped charge and the main armor itself. Primitive solutions to a terrifyingly modern problem. And strangely enough, some of them actually worked. The terrifying thing about shaped charges was not just their power. It was how cheaply they could threaten something enormously expensive. A tank costing hundreds of thousands of dollars could now be destroyed by a weapon small enough to carry in your hands. And once militaries realized that reality, armored crews became obsessed with one question: how do you stop a jet of molten metal moving faster than sound? At first, nobody had a perfect answer, so soldiers improvised. During the later years of the Second World War, tanks began appearing covered in strange additions. Spare track links welded onto the hull, sandbags piled on top of armor, logs tied to the sides. Even wire mesh and metal cages started showing up in the field. To outsiders, it looked chaotic, almost desperate. But there was logic behind it. Shaped. Charges work best when they detonate at a very specific distance from the armor surface. To close, and the metal jet doesn't fully form, too far away. The jet begins losing focus and energy before reaching the steel underneath. That meant even crude spacing could sometimes reduce penetration dramatically. A sandbag was no longer just a sandbag, it became survival. German side. Skirts, originally added to defend against anti-tank rifles, suddenly gained a second purpose. Thin metal plates hanging off the sides of tanks could prematurely trigger shaped charges before they reached the main armor. Not perfect protection, but sometimes not perfect, was enough to keep the crew alive. And then came one of the simplest anti-tank weapons ever created, the Molotov cocktail, a glass bottle filled with burning fuel sounds, primitive compared to tanks weighing dozens of tons. But in urban combat, Molotovs became terrifyingly effective when used correctly. Second World War tanks were not airtight machines. Small gaps existed around hatches, turret rings, engine covers, and ventilation openings. Burning fuel could seep into those spaces and spread fire directly inside the vehicle. Suddenly, boom! The crew wasn't fighting penetration anymore. They were fighting suffocation. Smoke filled the compartment. Oxygen disappeared. Flames spread across wiring, fuel, and ammunition. Even if the tank itself survived, the people inside often could not stay in it, and throwing one of those bottles required unbelievable courage. Imagine running toward an active tank while machine guns sweep the streets around you. One mistake, and you're dead instantly. But desperation creates terrifying bravery in war. By the end of the Second World War, tanks had evolved into monsters compared to the crude machines of 1916. Thicker armor, bigger guns, faster engines, better mobility. But anti-tank weapons had evolved even faster. And after the war ended, something appeared that changed armored warfare forever. Guided missiles. Now infantry no longer needed to sneak. Within 20 meters of a tank carrying a disposable launcher, they could destroy armor from kilometers away. The battlefield suddenly became much larger, far more dangerous. Early anti-tank guided missiles looked primitive by modern standards. Operators manually steered them toward targets using wires connected to the missile itself. It's almost like controlling a flying bomb with a joystick. But despite their limitations, the message was clear. Distance no longer protected tanks, and then the Soviet Union introduced a weapon that would become legendary across countless wars. The RPG-7, cheap, portable, simple enough to use almost anywhere, and deadly enough to remain relevant for decades. From Vietnam to the Middle East, from insurgencies to modern urban warfare, the RPG became one of the most recognizable anti-tank weapons ever created because it followed the same brutal rule that shaped modern warfare. If you can destroy expensive armor cheaply enough, eventually numbers become impossible to ignore, and the next anti-tank concept would become even more disturbing, because instead of piercing armor directly, it weaponized the armor itself. Most anti-tank weapons follow the same basic idea: punch through the armor, kill whatever is inside. Simple, but during the Cold War, the British developed something deeply unsettling. A weapon that didn't need to penetrate armor in the traditional sense at all. It was called HESH, explosive squash head. And instead of drilling through steel like a shaped charge, HESH attacked the tank in a completely different way. Imagine throwing a lump of explosive clay against a wall. That is essentially how the round worked. When the shell struck the armor, the explosive inside spread itself across the surface like paste before detonating a split second later. The blast sent an enormous shockwave through the steel plate itself, and that's where things became horrifying. When the shockwave reached the inner side of the armor, Pieces of metal violently broke away from the inside surface at lethal speed. Not tiny fragments, sometimes chunks weighing several kilograms. The shell didn't always need to penetrate the tank. The armor itself became the shrapnel. Imagine sitting inside a sealed steel box. When a massive piece of your own wall suddenly tears loose and ricochets through the compartment like a cannonball, that was the nightmare Chef created, in a twisted way. It resembled the same spalling effect tank crews suffered during the First World War, except now weaponized intentionally on a far larger scale, and because HESH relied on shockwaves rather than deep penetration. It became extremely effective against concrete fortifications, too. One round could devastate bunkers, walls, and armored targets alike. But the danger of these weapons wasn't theoretical. There was a tragic incident during the Iraq War involving two British Challenger 2 tanks. In poor visibility conditions, one vehicle mistakenly identified another friendly tank as an enemy position. 2 rounds were fired. One struck near an open hatch. The explosion sent fragments and superheated debris directly into the turret compartment, killing and injuring members of the crew almost instantly. Even one of the most advanced tanks on Earth could still become deadly to the people inside it. That reality forced tank designers into another stage of evolution. Traditional steel armor was no longer enough. Modern shaped charges and HESH rounds had become too powerful. Engineers realized that simply adding thicker steel created massive, slower vehicles while offering diminishing protection. So instead of building armor thicker, they started building it smarter. This led to one of the biggest breakthroughs in armored warfare since tanks. First appeared composite armor. The British were among the first to perfect it with something called Javelin armor. Unlike traditional solid steel plating, Javelin used multiple layers of different materials working together: steel, ceramics, elastic compounds, special backing plates. Each layer disrupted incoming attacks differently. When a shaped charge struck the armor, the outer layer triggered the explosion. Then the ceramic layers shattered violently, distorting the superheated jet trying to penetrate deeper inside. Instead of slicing cleanly through the vehicle, the jet became unstable and fragmented itself apart. The armor essentially forced the weapon to destroy its own effectiveness. And suddenly, anti-tank crews around the world realized something frustrating. Their old weapons were no longer reliable. There are reports from the Iraq invasion of Challenger tanks surviving multiple RPG strikes and even anti-tank missile hits while keeping the crew alive inside. The age of simple penetration was ending. But warfare never stops adapting, because while Western engineers focused on complex armor systems, the Soviets came up with something even more aggressive: armor that explodes on purpose. For most of history, armor had one job: take the hit, absorb the damage, protect the crew. But Soviet engineers looked at modern anti-tank weapons and realized something terrifying. Passive protection was no longer enough. Shaped charges had become too powerful. Missiles were getting smarter. Portable launchers were everywhere, so they came up with an insane solution. What if the armor fought back? That idea became explosive reactive armor. ERA. At first glance, ERA looks simple: small rectangular bricks mounted across the surface of a tank. But inside each block sits a thin layer of explosives sandwiched between metal plates, and when a shaped charge penetrates the outer layer, the armor detonates outward. Violently, the explosion throws metal plates across the path of the incoming jet, disrupting it before it can fully penetrate the main armor beneath. Instead of allowing the shaped charge to focus all its energy into one point, ERA tears the jet apart mid-dash penetration. It was brutal, effective, and extremely Soviet. In philosophy, the tank literally explodes parts of itself to survive. For a while, it worked remarkably well. Suddenly, RPGs and older anti-tank missiles became far less reliable against modern armored vehicles equipped with reactive armor. But warfare always adapts very quickly. Anti-tank designers created a countermeasure: tandem warheads. The concept was terrifyingly simple. The first explosive charge triggered the reactive armor intentionally. Then, milliseconds later, second-shaped charge punched through the now exposed armor underneath. One explosion to clear the defense, another to kill the crew. The cycle continued again. Protection countermeasure. Adaptation counter-dash adaptation. An endless technological knife fight between engineers, and while missiles evolved, tank guns themselves became terrifyingly advanced too. This is where anti-armor warfare reached a level that almost stops feeling human, because modern tank-killing rounds don't always rely on explosives anymore. Sometimes they rely purely on speed, extreme speed, the most feared kinetic anti-tank round. Today is called a APFSDS, armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding. SAB. The name sounds technical and boring. The reality is horrifying. Imagine firing a metal dart nearly 1 meter long at hypersonic velocity. That's essentially what it is. Inside the tank gun barrel, the penetrator sits inside a larger casing called a sabot. Once fired, the sabot falls away after leaving the barrel, allowing the long penetrator rod to continue forward at incredible speed. Some modern rounds travel faster than 1,700 meters per second. That is over 5 times the speed of sound, and unlike missiles or shaped charges, these rounds carry no explosive warhead. They don't need one. The penetration itself is catastrophic enough. Many modern penetrators are made from depleted uranium or tungsten alloys. Depleted uranium is especially terrifying because it has a strange property called pyrophoricity. When fragments break apart during penetration, they ignite on contact with air, so the round doesn't just pierce armor, it enters the tank as a burning metal spear. Moving at absurd velocity while spraying fire and fragments through the crew compartment. Everything happens almost instantly. Armor shatters inward. Metal fragments ricochet everywhere, fuel ignites, ammunition cooks off, pressure waves slam through the compartment faster than the human brain can process what's happening, and inside that confined space, there is almost nowhere for the energy to escape except through the people trapped inside. Some battlefield reports describe penetration so violent that crews were killed before they even understood the tank had been hit. That's the terrifying reality of modern anti-armor. Warfare, not cinematic explosions, not heroic last stands, just physics operating at lethal extremes inside a sealed metal box. And nowhere demonstrated this horror more brutally than one specific tank design flaw that became infamous across modern battlefields: the ammunition carousel inside Soviet tanks. Modern tanks are supposed to protect their crews at all costs. That is the entire purpose of the machine. But during the Cold War, Soviet tank designers made a decision that would later become infamous across battlefields around the world. A decision that saved space, reduced weight, lowered production costs, and dramatically increased the chances of catastrophic death inside the vehicle. The problem was the ammunition carousel. Unlike many Western tanks, several Soviet designs, such as the T-72, stored ammunition in a circular autoloader system directly beneath the turret, surrounding the crew compartment itself. The idea made sense on paper. By using an autoloader instead of a human loader, tanks could be built smaller. Lower profile meant harder to hit. Fewer crew members meant lower costs. The Soviet Union could mass produce enormous numbers of tanks efficiently. Efficient, that word always sounds comforting until war begins. Because once the armor was penetrated, the ammunition stored inside that carousel became a nightmare. Waiting and nightmare waiting to ignite, and modern anti-tank rounds are extremely good at creating fire. A penetrating shaped charge or kinetic round entering the crew compartment often showered the interior with superheated fragments and burning particles. If even one of those fragments reached the propellant charges stored around the turret basket, the result was catastrophic. Instant chain reaction, massive overpressure, violent ammunition cooked off, and then came the image that became anonymous. With destroyed Soviet-designed tanks, the turret launch, entire turrets blown completely off the hull, and thrown meters into the air like bottle caps, exploding from pressure. To outsiders, The footage almost looks unreal. A multi-ton steel turret, suddenly flying upward in a fireball. But inside the vehicle, the reality is far worse than the explosion itself, because everything happens almost instantly. The crew compartment transforms into an overpressurized furnace filled with burning propellant, fragmentation and shock waves powerful enough to destroy internal organs immediately in many cases. Survival is effectively impossible. Tank crews around the world eventually developed a grim understanding of these explosions. Once the ammunition carousel ignites, the tank is usually lost completely. And yet, despite the danger, these designs continued serving for decades, because warfare is rarely about perfect solutions. It is about compromises, protection versus mobility, cost versus survivability, production speed versus crew safety. Every tank ever built is essentially a series of calculated risks. Western tank designers eventually approached the problem differently. Vehicles like the M1 Abrams and Leopard 2 began storing ammunition inside separate armored compartments with blowout panels. The concept was brutally practical. If the ammunition detonates, direct the explosion away from the crew, sacrifice the tank if necessary, save the people inside. And surprisingly, it worked. There are documented cases of Western tanks losing ammunition, storage compartments, entirely while crews survived because the blast vented outward instead of into the fighting compartment. But even with safer designs, modern anti-tank weapons kept becoming more terrifying, because now missiles know. Longer aimed for the strongest armor, they aimed for the weakest point possible, the roof. And that led to one of the most feared anti-tank weapons ever created, the Javelin. For decades, tank armor followed a simple rule: the thickest protection faced forward. Because historically, that's where the danger came from. Enemy tanks, anti-tank. Guns direct fire from the front. But modern missile designers looked at tanks and realized something almost embarrassingly obvious. The roof armor was much thinner, and if you could attack from above, even the most heavily armored vehicles suddenly became vulnerable. That realization created a completely new kind of anti-tank weapon, top attack missiles, and among them, one name became legendary: Javelin. Unlike older guided missiles that required operators to manually steer the weapon all the way to the target, the Javelin changed the game completely. Fire, lock, leave, once launched. The missile guides itself. For the operator, this changes everything. Instead of remaining exposed while controlling the missile toward an incoming tank, soldiers can immediately relocate after firing. But what truly terrified tank crews was the attack profile itself. The missile climbs upward after launch, then dives down onto the target from above, exactly where the armor is weakest. Modern tanks are engineering masterpieces built to survive incredible punishment from the front and sides. But even advanced vehicles cannot place extremely thick armor across every surface without becoming impossibly heavy. Physics always demands compromise and top attack. Weapons exploit that compromise mercilessly. When a modern missile strikes the roof of a tank, the results are often devastating. The shaped charge jet punches downward into the crew compartment, igniting ammunition, fuel, and everything combustible inside. In many battlefield videos, the explosion seems delayed by a second or two. Then suddenly, the entire vehicle erupts. From within, that delay is often the moment when internal ammunition begins cooking off. And once that process starts, the tank usually cannot be saved. But even more disturbing is how anti-tank warfare has. It's become increasingly asymmetrical. A modern main battle tank may cost several $1 million. A guided missile capable of destroying it costs only a fraction. Of that imbalance changes warfare dramatically, and then came the next evolution: one nobody. It's fully expected: FPV drones. At first they looked almost harmless. Small commercial quadcopters assembled from civilian components. Lightweight frames, cheap cameras, basic batteries. The kind of thing you would expect to see racing through abandoned buildings on social media. Then someone strapped explosives Underneath them, an armored warfare changed overnight. Unlike traditional missiles, FPV drones are terrifyingly flexible. Operators can fly them through windows, underneath vehicles, into engine compartments, or directly toward weak points in the armor. And because the pilot sees through the drone's onboard camera in real time, the attack becomes disturbingly precise. It turns anti-tank warfare into something closer to a first-person video game. Except the consequences are real. Modern drones can strike exposed optics, ammunition storage, engine decks, turret rings, or thin roof armor with shocking accuracy. Even if the initial explosion doesn't destroy the tank outright, it can disable critical systems, trap the crew, or force abandonment. And unlike expensive guided missiles, FPV drones are cheap, extremely cheap. Some cost less than a household appliance, yet they can destroy vehicles worth millions. That cost imbalance terrifies militaries around the world more than the drones themselves, because throughout history, powerful armies often relied on expensive technology dominating the battlefield. But now, inexpensive weapons are beginning to erase that advantage, and tank crews know it. That's why modern battlefields have started producing something almost surreal. Massive armored vehicles covered in cages, nets, improvised armor, and bizarre metal structures welded across the roof. Internet users mock them as turtle tanks. But underneath the memes is fear, because those crews understand something important. The battlefield has changed again, and this time, nobody is fully sure how to adapt.
There was a time when tanks represented dominance, raw industrial power, a nation's ability to manufacture steel, engines, guns, and armor on a massive scale. When a column of tanks appeared on the horizon, it meant momentum, territory, fear. But modern battlefields are beginning to tell a different story. Now, a soldier hiding kilometers away with a headset, a controller, and a homemade drone can threaten a machine once considered nearly unstoppable. And that changes something deeper than tactics.
It changes psychology. Because tank crews today are no longer only afraid of enemy tanks or missiles. They are afraid of invisible threats constantly hovering above them. Small drones hidden in the sky, silent cameras searching for weak points, operators waiting patiently for the perfect angle. The battlefield no longer feels mechanical. It feels hunted. That is why modern tanks increasingly resemble moving fortresses covered in improvised defenses. Steel cages welded onto turrets, layers of wire mesh, hanging chains, rubber panels, extra plates mounted in strange positions. To outsiders, it can look ridiculous. But those strange structures reveal something important. Even the people inside the tanks know the armor alone is no longer enough. Because FPV drones exploit the one weakness every armored vehicle still has: exposure. A tank must see to fight. It must move to survive. It must expose optics, sensors, vents, hatches, antennas, and weak armor zones to function effectively. And drones are becoming frighteningly good at targeting exactly those areas. Some attacks don't even aim to destroy the tank immediately. Disabling tracks can immobilize it. Destroying optics can blind it. Damaging the engine can trap the crew inside. And once a tank is disabled on a modern battlefield, more drones usually follow. That's what makes this evolution so dangerous. Drones are not replacing traditional anti-tank weapons. They are multiplying them. A battlefield once dominated by expensive missiles and artillery is now flooded with thousands of small airborne threats that are cheap, disposable, and terrifyingly effective. And unlike tanks, drones evolve incredibly fast. A tank platform may take years to design and manufacture. Drone technology changes every few months. Software updates, improved batteries, better cameras, fiber optic guidance systems immune to jamming, artificial intelligence-assisted targeting.
the adaptation cycle is becoming almost impossible to keep up with. For over 100 years, tanks survived because they could adapt faster than the weapons designed to destroy them. But now, for the first time, that balance may be shifting. Some military analysts are already asking uncomfortable questions. What happens if tanks become too vulnerable to operate effectively? What happens when a $500 drone can reliably destroy a machine worth millions? What happens when battlefield awareness from the sky becomes constant and unavoidable?
Because historically, tanks relied on armor to survive uncertainty. But drones are removing uncertainty itself. There are fewer places left to hide. And yet, history suggests something important. People have declared the death of the tank many times before. After anti-tank rifles, after shaped charges, after guided missiles, after attack helicopters. And every single time, tanks adapted and survived. Which means the real question may not be whether tanks will disappear. The real question is what they will evolve into next. Because warfare never stops evolving, and neither does humanity's ability to find new ways of killing each other. If you look at the last 100 years of armored warfare, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Nothing stays dominant forever.
Every revolutionary weapon eventually creates its own countermeasure. Every breakthrough in protection inspires an even deadlier breakthrough in destruction. The tank itself is proof of that. It was created to survive machine guns and trench warfare. Then anti-tank rifles appeared. So armor became thicker. Then shaped charges arrived. So composite armor was invented. Then reactive armor countered shaped charges. Then tandem warheads defeated reactive armor. Then active protection systems began intercepting missiles in midair. And now, swarms of FPV drones are forcing militaries to rethink everything again. The cycle never stops. Because war is ultimately a competition between human intelligence and human cruelty. And sometimes, the two become impossible to separate. Modern tanks today are technological monsters compared to the machines of the First World War. Thermal imaging systems can detect targets kilometers away in darkness. Stabilized cannons fire accurately while moving at high speed. Advanced computers calculate ballistic trajectories instantly. Some active protection systems can even detect.
Until you remember something important. Every tank is still operated by human beings, people sitting inside a confined metal space, relying on layers of engineering to keep them alive, while the battlefield outside searches endlessly for a weakness. And no matter how advanced the armor becomes, physics remains undefeated. Explosive force still creates pressure. Metal still fragments. Heat still burns. Shockwaves still destroy the human body. That reality has never changed since the first tanks crossed the trenches of the First World War. Only the technology became more sophisticated. And strangely, despite all the terrifying weapons humanity has invented, the most dangerous part of anti-tank warfare may not even be the destruction itself. It's the cost imbalance. Because throughout history, military power often depended on expensive industrial superiority. Nations with more factories, more steel, and more advanced vehicles usually dominated weaker opponents. But modern warfare is beginning to challenge that logic. Today, relatively cheap drones assembled from commercial parts can threaten some of the most advanced armored vehicles ever created. Small teams with portable launchers can destroy equipment worth millions. Information spreads instantly. Adaptations happen in real time. The battlefield is decentralizing.
And that changes everything. For tank crews, the psychological pressure is enormous. In earlier wars, danger mostly came from known directions. Front lines were clearer. Threats were easier to predict. Now, danger can arrive from anywhere. Above, behind, through a window, from a drone hovering silently hundreds of meters away. Modern tank crews aren't just fighting enemy soldiers anymore. They are fighting surveillance itself. And perhaps that is the most unsettling evolution of all. Because warfare is no longer becoming more personal. It is becoming more distant. Operators destroy vehicles through screens. Drones turn combat into remote observation. Algorithms increasingly assist targeting decisions. The battlefield begins feeling less like human conflict and more like systems hunting systems.
Yet despite everything, tanks will probably not disappear completely. Not yet, because armored vehicles still provide something armies desperately need: mobility, protection, firepower, the ability to physically control terrain. And until another machine can combine all three better than a tank can, armor will continue evolving instead of vanishing. But one thing is certain: the future tank may look nothing like the tanks we know today, and the future battlefield may become even more terrifying than anything seen before. When people watch tanks in movies, they usually focus on the machine, the armor, the cannon, the explosions. But after more than a century of armored warfare, the real story was never about steel. It was always about vulnerability. Because every tank ever built represents the same human belief: that with enough engineering, enough armor, enough technology, we can finally create something safe enough to survive war. And every generation of warfare proves the opposite. The moment a new defense appears, someone immediately begins designing a weapon to defeat it. That is the hidden pattern running through the entire history of tanks. The First World War created armor to survive machine guns. Then anti-tank rifles appeared. The Second World War created heavier armor. Then shaped charges changed everything. Composite armor stopped shaped charges more effectively. Then tandem warheads evolved to defeat composite protection.
Reactive armor answered reactive warheads. Top attack missiles answered reactive armor. Electronic warfare attempted to stop drones. Fiber optic drones bypassed electronic warfare. Every solution creates another problem. Every breakthrough eventually becomes obsolete. And somewhere in the middle of that cycle are the crews themselves. Human beings trapped inside machines that are constantly becoming both more advanced and more vulnerable at the same time. That's the part many people misunderstand about modern warfare. Technology does not remove fear. It changes the shape of it. The crews inside early tanks feared artillery and machine guns. Modern crews fear invisible drones hovering kilometers away. Different century, same fear. And maybe that is the strangest truth about tanks. For all their terrifying power, tanks were never truly designed to make war safe.